My name is Frank Guridy. I'm a professor of history in African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. I'm also the executive director of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and I'm super excited to be here and invite you to what will promise to be a stimulating conversation and as you saw, a historically significant venue. So what is the Holder Initiative? Named after the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, the Holder Initiative aims to inspire students to draw upon their superior liberal arts education to do impactful justice and democracy work during their time on campus and beyond. Through the creation of timely and innovative programming, the sponsorship of student research projects with our fellowship program, and internships, and the creation of a justice-oriented curriculum, the Holder Initiative aims to cultivate a broad conception of justice, one that seeks to empower students to engage in justice and democracy work that addresses the many challenges of our time. I want to thank, before we proceed, Beth Manchester, the Senior Associate Director, for organizing this event, for running the day-to-day operations of the Holder Initiative. A round of applause for her, probably outside. As well as Alex Taylor, who's one of our STAR students, who's helping her tonight as well. So those of you who are familiar with my own work know that one of the major areas of justice and democracy work that I care about deeply is the world of sports, and in particular its relationship with its larger impact on our society. My most recent attempt to bring those concerns together is The Stadium, my recently published book that was published back in August by Basic Books. And I am so thrilled and delighted to be able to engage in conversation with two extraordinary people who I'm sharing the stage with tonight, who I will introduce you to now. To my immediate right is Professor Amira Rose Davis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, a place where I taught for many years. She is a groundbreaking scholar, historian, and commentator who specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. Recently named a Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, she is finishing up her current book, Can't Eat a Medal: The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press. Davis is the co-author of the children's book, Go, Wilmer, Go, the biography of the book about the legendary track star Wilma Rudolph, which was co-authored with Michael Long. She has published articles in the Journal of African American History, American Quarterly, the Radical History Review, among many other scholarly publications. With Joseph Darda, she co-edited the path-breaking 2023 special issue of American Quarterly, which is entitled The Body Issue, Sports and the Politics of Embodiment, which is a landmark publication which really highlights the amazing work that's been happening in sports studies over the last few years. Davis has provided sports commentary for media outlets, including NPR, CNN, and the BBC. She's written, produced, and featured in multiple ESPN projects, including authoring and narrating the digital essay, Title IX, The Fight Continues, for which she won a Silver Clio Award. Davis was also the co-host of the outstanding feminist sports podcast, Burn It All Down, which has been on a hiatus, but it was an amazing work of sports commentary and criticism. I urge you, if you weren't listening when it was out, you should go find it in the archives. It's an extraordinary podcast that was around for quite some time. And she's also the host of Season 3 of American Prodigies, The Rise of Black Girls in Gymnastics. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Davis. Joining Amira and I on the stage is the author, filmmaker, and sports writer, Dave Zirin. Named one of UTNE's readers' 50 visionaries who are changing our world, Dave Zirin writes about the politics of sports for The Nation magazine. Indeed, he was the nation's first sports writer in the magazine's history. Winner of the Sport and Society and the Northeastern University School of Journalism's Excellent in Sports Journalism Award, Zirin is also the host of the well-known Edge of Sports podcast. He's the author of many articles, many articles, essays, op-eds, and books. Too many to mention here, but I'll just mention a few. The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World, The John Carlos Story, The Sports Moment That Changed the World, and Bad Sports, How Owners Are Ruining the Games We Love. And changing the world. Probably for the worst. And there are many others that he's written. He wrote and narrated the documentary Not Just a Game, Power Politics in American Sports, and also Behind the Shield, The Power and Politics of the NFL, which we had the privilege of screening at Columbia in 2023. For years, I've been teaching his book. Those in the audience know this book well, many of you, I think. Brazil's Dance with the Devil, the World Cup, the Olympics, and the Struggle for Democracy, which is an incisive analysis of the social, political, and economic consequences of Brazil's decision to host the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Summer Olympic Games. Dave has been everywhere, as you know. He's all over the place in the mainstream media outlets, everywhere you turn in terms of commentary on sport and society and politics. In my judgment, Dave has played a pivotal role in the transformation of sports journalism and commentary during the past 2 decades. Indeed, he was covering and writing about sport and politics long before it became fashionable to do so. In this way, he's been a pioneer, known for his consistently insightful analysis of justice and injustice in the world of sports. Please join me in welcoming Dave Zirin to Columbia. Or not to Columbia, to the Schomburg Center in Harlem. So here's how we'll proceed. For the next 50 minutes or so, Amira, Dave, and I will engage in a conversation about sports and politics and sport and society in the country's past and present. And we'll use the stadium, my book, as a way to get into this discussion. I've asked him to offer some thoughts about the book, and we'll talk about the book for a bit. But then I would like, if we can, because I think people in the audience are going to want to hear from them about a variety of issues, about a larger conversation about sports, politics, and society. And I'm particularly eager to get their thoughts on where we are and where we might be going in light of the outcome of the presidential election of a few weeks ago. And though our time is short, we will try to reserve some time for questions and answers toward the end of our time together. Okay? So now I'm going to transition to the chair, and then we'll begin. So I thought it would make sense for me to talk about what I was trying to do with this book. I was trying to convey to the reader that stadiums, these large edifices that dot the landscapes of cities around towns around the world, are much more than places to go see sporting events and your favorite concert performer. I wanted to offer a history of the United States, the nation itself, through the lens of this ubiquitous institution, the stadium. I wanted to chart the history of the country's social hierarchies, right? Its politics, from the ways that the United States government has used it to further its political objectives, to the ways that the stadium became a prime venue where America's marginalized and the dispossessed could express their desires and discontents. I also wanted to chart the growth of the American sport industry, to historicize its political and cultural significance, in order to explain how the stadium as an institution became ubiquitous, how we found them all over the country, right? How we can explain these moments of massive stadium construction from the 1920s to the 1960s and 70s, and really continually unabated since the 1990s and early 2000s. And I wanted to highlight the ways that the sport industry and corporate interests have turned the stadium into catalysts of new forms of territorial colonization and wealth extraction, a phenomenon we might call gentrification. Okay? So these are the things I wanted to sort of talk about in terms of my sort of interventions. And what I thought I'd do now is I'd just turn it over, starting with Amira, to talk about just observations, questions, comments you might have about the book.
Yeah. Whoa, my voice is right here.
Yeah, cool.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and to share the stage with y'all as well. And especially to talk about this book, which I love. I think that you just have such a knack for getting, there's, when you read something that changes the way you see something forever, right? I got off the plane at JFK at a ridiculous time this morning and was like half awake, half asleep, and looked up right when we went by Citi Field. And I was like, oh, look, now I'm thinking of all of these corporate interests and all of these things. I think that's what the stadium offers. You say you want to offer a people's history of American sporting stadiums, and I think you do that and so much more. So I have so many questions because one of the ways that you present this history is to give pieces of history about individual stadiums, as well as the people and the meanings of those spaces, but also you're moving through time, and so that we really do get to see how these ideas about stadiums, what happens in and among them, both are growing and changing, but also have a lot of continuity. And I think that as a mark of the strength of your argument in the book, we see all the time. Just a month ago, what, is it December now?
We're in December.
What is time anymore?
I know, it's true.
A month ago, in the last few days of the presidential election, when we once again were at Madison Square Garden having a Nazi rally, if you read the first, is it the first chapter? The first chapter is all about the history of Madison Square Park becoming Madison Square Garden. And so I think that it's so legible to this moment, and that's great history, you know what I mean? So for me, I have, like I said, a lot of questions, but the first place I really wanted to start was to talk about methodology for a little bit, if we could, because I like history. This took you a number of years to do, and it's thorough, and we can see that. I'm wondering how you take something like built environment, like stadiums, right? Part of this is convincing people that these sites matter beyond what they think they are. And how do you excavate all of the layered meanings on top of that? And some of those you can find in archives, some of those you can find in financial documents, but I'm also wondering of how you thought about extracting the personal nostalgia and all these ideas wrapped up in them, because you end up juggling, methodologically speaking, a lot of different archival sources. Mm-hmm. You're turning to a lot of different spaces to erect this history, and I think in many ways it's very fitting because the stadiums themselves are containing so many things that your method had to match that energy, if you will. And so I really wanted to hear a little bit about your method, if it changed over time, if this book is what you thought it would be when you set out to write it, or if you learned something about stadiums along the way. Because I can imagine a world in which you're like, hey, we really need to talk more about stadiums. And as you get into the weeds more, you're like, wait, there's so many other layers to this that I didn't even realize when I was taking this project on.
Yeah, no, thank you, Amira. Dave, do you want to chime in now, or should I take a stab at Amira's question?
Well, I'll chime in only because it builds on what Amira said. Just real quick to the audience, how many people have seen the movie The Terminator or Terminator 2? Well, the thing about those movies is that the protagonist is made of steel and iron, and it's not human, but it propels the story forward, this thing. Played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, also kind of a thing. Oh, sorry. And I think that's, of course, fantasy. Your book, of course, is sometimes very harsh reality. What was it like? But what I love about the book is that the stadium as an entity is alive in the book as its own protagonist, like this kind of Terminator, relentlessly conquering neighborhoods and cities and exurbs across the landscape, showing up every 4 years in a country for the summer games, turning it upside down, subjects of debate. And I love the conceit of that, because one of the things that is commonly just a common truism of economics is that capitalism is a process that's always moving, always in motion, always in motion. And yet the way we've talked about stadiums politically over the years, and I'll include myself in this in one of the books I wrote about sports bosses, we talk about them as, boom, this one thing in this one city, this one piece of concrete, and maybe we'll talk about what it represents, but we don't talk about, A, how it links with other stadiums and other cities in the present tense, but B, and this is where your book is so great, the historical continuum, because it tells its own story as this kind of protagonist that you think is inert, but is actually always active. And so I was hoping maybe you could speak, frankly, to the challenges of working with a protagonist that's not flesh and blood.
Yeah, great questions. Part of the methodology is that I've been going to stadiums for 40 years.
Yeah.
Because I'm a middle-aged dude. Like so many people, my encounters with the stadium was, going to games with my dad and my mom, right? Going to Yankee Stadium, listening to Bob Shepard, his voice booming out of the loudspeakers of the speakers of Yankee Stadium, or going to Shea Stadium, or going to Madison Square Garden to see the circus. and occasionally a Knicks game, and never a Rangers game. Not because I didn't like hockey, but it just wasn't financially in our kind of accessible to us. So part of it is that by going to games in many different venues, and then in my own research, then going to many different venues, I came to appreciate very quickly the dynamics of what happens inside the building and outside. Right? I think many people who write about stadiums, as you said, Dave, talk about it as an architectural structure. Right? Much of the writing about stadiums is about the architecture, the design, right? And the fetishizing of that design, right? And very little about what happens when tens of thousands of people will walk into these buildings, right? For a variety of purposes, right? So part of it was like, right, when I was going to games, I noticed the unruly fan. I noticed the occasional protest moment. I noticed the things that were happening, the interaction between the crowd and the performers, whether it was an athlete or a concert performer. So some of it was just that, right? And being a sports fan and understanding the dynamics of sports spectatorship. So there was that. I think the other thing that made this protagonist come to life, this is going to the methodology question, is I took full advantage of what digital sources give us now. If you wanted to write about what happened at a Yankee game in 1979, all right, you'd have to rely on what Dick Young wrote about it, or some journalist or beat writer, so usually a white guy, writing about what happened in the game. Now, because of sports enthusiasts posting all sorts of things onto YouTube, right? I mean, like, what's extraordinary is being able to access the wide array of events that happen in these buildings. From everything from championship games to highlight films to footage of a political speech to, looking at the crowd when Ronald Reagan in 1976 at the Kemper Arena in Kansas City is making this kind of earlier iteration of what we clearly see as right-wing politics in 1976, right? So to see that and have access to that within minutes or seconds, right? That allowed me to get around the archival problem of having to rely on the beat writer dude to tell me about what was going on in a given moment, right? And the same thing what we see with the freedom movements of that era. I mean, so many speeches and protests, amazing footage of the gay games, the inaugural gay games in 1982. It brought me to Kezar Stadium, just being able to see, those archival, that footage available on the internet now, right, in various digital repositories. So that it also gave me a sense of what's going on in the stands among the crowd, right? Because cameramen, for better or for worse, are looking at the crowd and getting a sense of what's going on in the spectatorship, right? So much of what I was doing was actually not looking at the players on the field, but looking at the stuff in the background. Right? So that gave me a lot of information that I think earlier generations of historians wouldn't be able to get. Right? And then, of course, I relied on, typical archival sources because the stadium is ubiquitous. That means the archives are ubiquitous. So where are they? They're in municipal archives. They're in state archives. They're in the archives of universities because in the 1920s, college football became really popular, and stadiums across the country were being built by universities all over the place to accommodate the growing phenomenon of college football at that time. Right? So Tulane archives are super important to me. The records of booster organizations like the Sugar Bowl Committee, they were available to me and they gave me enormous insights, right? So some of what I use with traditional archives combined with digital sources, combined with my own ethnographic observations doing this, being in these venues for so many years, right? So I think, and then I think also I really try to pay attention to the iconographic aspect of the stadium. I mean, I can recall when I was growing up in Queens in the 70s, and when I would leave Shea Stadium or when we were riding on the Van Wyck Expressway through Willets Point and smelling the terrible toxic fumes that you would smell in that era when you would drive going by Shea Stadium. Shea Stadium was known as a suburban place, but it really wasn't. It was really in the middle of an industrial sort of neighborhood, Willets Point. And be able to kind of focus, to be awed by the size of the building itself, right? To sort of see, even at night, the kind of red lights on the top of the building that would signal to the jet planes that were landing at LaGuardia Airport that this structure is here, right? And I think that I tried to kind of bring to life this building that is ubiquitous in a way that pays attention to these various dimensions, right? The performers, spectators, and also the people who work there.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and I like that one of the things that you touched on is something that really captivated me throughout the book, which is how you do the interplay between that iconography and these kind of meanings that we attach to stadiums. And I was thinking about this, really taken with your point that we now live in a time where it's become very socially stratified. It's very hard to have access to a lot of professional sporting events. The ticket prices are ridiculous. I know because my 8-year-old is suddenly obsessed with basketball and wants to go to NBA games. And I was like, okay, cool, the Celtics are playing the Mavs. Oof. And I looked at the tickets. Ridiculous. Oof. Anyways, in American Airlines arena, like if you sit in the nosebleeds, it's like straight vertical. Like it's not even the place to do that. And anyways.
And my understanding of that, the new arena in Austin, just to see UT games, is also now much more expensive.
Absolutely. This is it. So I obviously was like super convinced by that argument. But your constant reminder that these are public places, these are, again, a people's history of these stadiums. And one of the things that I think you offer is that ability to reckon with the fact that like people may not have ever gone to these places to see sporting events, but they might have gone when the circus was in town. They might have gone to a political rally. They might have been refugees from Hurricane Katrina squatting, in Houston. And those are baked into these other kind of meanings, but it doesn't seem to topple the iconography of the nostalgia attached to certain places. And I think sometimes we see that through like places that people are very fond of, the stadiums we can name, and the ones that, as you describe, come from an era that seem very boilerplate. They're just there. They're the metal and I don't know the building materials. But
concrete.
Yes. So I am really thinking about this tension. It's not really a tension, but it's a fun, it's what I call the textured gray, right, area of experiencing stadium spaces. And I was thinking about that, especially when you bring in the circus. And you mention your memories of going to the circus, but you also do a really great job historicizing circus events in these kind of early, stadium spaces as one of these big draws. And I was really captivated with you describing the circus very aptly. If anybody's familiar with Greatest Showman, it's very kind of similar to that, where it was about spectating the other. And there was this instant barrier, whether it's the subversion of gender norms or of non-white people performing and laboring in certain ways. And what struck me about your articulation of the circus historically was how much it felt like it mapped on to the various circuses that we have now. Obviously, football is what a lot of people go to, but I think that you can layer it into a lot of places. And so that made me think, when we put these two things together, what particularities do you see that happens between spectators in the actual stadium space and the laborers or performance that's happening that is being changed by the streaming generation, by the inaccessibility to these spaces? Like I say this all the time, I'm a Manchester United fan. Things have been hard, okay? It's a new era. I'm having optimism, I'm trying it on. But I'm very aware that like I was not born in Manchester. I don't have this lore about what it means to be from a specific place that is birth of industrialization and then losing it. And also, I've never been to Old Trafford, right? I have a Lego set that I've built of it, right? But thinking about what it means, and yet it still feels some way, like I still can access those emotions. But I'm thinking we live in an age where that's how a lot of people experience stadium spaces. And the way that you weave the narrative through of all these other public uses, I think, offers a way to trouble or think through, make it messy. I like messy history. Make these feelings messy about these spaces. But I was wondering if you saw how this digital age and this kind of proximity that people have. I mean, certainly with athletes, if you're standing there and yelling at them, hearing it there, but they also do it online. So where are you seeing that kind of spectacle of the other be replicated in and out of these spaces?
That's a great question. I think social media, it enables the spectator to be unruly in a whole different way, right, that you couldn't in the age of television, right? If you're upset at your favorite athlete, you really didn't have a way to communicate that unless you were at the venue itself booing, right? Or throwing things that at athletes, as was often the case, certainly in this city and other places, and certainly in Europe, that's for sure, right? So, whereas now, you've got this interesting juxtaposition where there's all sorts of unruly practices that the digital age enables, but then you juxtapose that with the securitization of the stadium space, where we're much more surveilled now than we used to be.
Absolutely.
Where a certain demographic is catered to, a more affluent demographic, that's only casually invested in the event itself. That doesn't mean that rich fans aren't into the game itself, but certainly, what I've seen, and we just saw this recently when we went to the Barclays Center. I took a number of my students to see the Nets versus the Celtics, and I was struck by, one, how quiet the crowd was. It was oddly quiet until the Celtics started taking the lead, and then all the Boston fans came out of the woodwork and made their presence known, which is interesting to a native New Yorker, which would have never happened decades ago. So, the streaming age allows for that kind of affiliation to transcend region, right? And we see that in stadiums across the country now. But I think that the stadium space, even though there's always a potential for unruliness because it's heavily securitized, because of the ways in which fan behavior is policed, it's in some ways it runs in opposition to what we're seeing in terms of social media. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that I think your question raises. I think. Yeah.
Some way, it feels like the soul has been.
In a lot of ways, yes. I don't want to romanticize the stadium of the past, which is easy for me to do as a middle-aged guy. But I think, and it also depends on the event itself. If you contrast a Nets game with the New York Liberty game, you will see a dramatically different scene altogether, right? In which the fan, interaction is much more lively. At least certainly in recent years, as the Liberty's been very successful on the court, right? But I do think the digital age has kind of reversed the dynamic that we used to see in the pre-digital age, right? I think because, as I argue in the book, after 9/11, as stadiums became heavily policed and securitized, and as security became big business, a phenomenon that we're seeing right on our campus at Columbia University, a heavily securitized university. Maybe more securitized than any stadium or arena in this city. I think that's the thing that marks the stadium space of recent decades that didn't exist beforehand.
Yeah. Let's stay on those shades of gray as we talk about stadiums, as we historicize them, because I think perhaps people would think a book like yours would be saying pro or con when it comes to stadiums, particularly on the question of public funding of stadiums. Because when people think about stadiums and politics, frankly, they're not thinking about 90% of what you're writing about. They're thinking about, is this going to go in taxpayer pocket or is this be privately funded? And of course, one of the dirty secrets about that is there really is no such thing as a privately funded stadium. Even the ones that are privately funded have tax breaks that would shame a nation of scoundrels. So these are monuments to corporate greed. That being said, that's not all they are, as your book demonstrates. And I'm not trying to make it too binary, like pro or con, but the people who are for public funding of stadiums, they don't have an economic argument because it truly does not exist. But what they do say is that, well, there's a different kind of wage, if you will, that it pays off to the city, a different kind of dividend. The same reason you have your memories and talk about being a sports fan for 40 years, or if you are able to comp tickets, hopefully to a Mavs game, and your adorable son is there in the front row, and that'll be something he takes with him. And I remember also when I was in college in the Twin Cities, and the Twins were talking about leaving because they weren't getting a publicly funded stadium, and one of their slogans for rallying public support was, "We don't want Minneapolis to turn into Fargo." Right. As if you take that team away, and then what they're saying is basically dead zone. Pretty offensive to people from Fargo, but that's the implication with the slogan. So that's what I ask. Does that argument in some twisted way have merit? Is that a legitimate argument to say that taxpayers should be robbed of funds to pay for these things because actually they do give something back in terms of memory and community that otherwise would not exist?
Yeah, great question, Dave. It's funny. I feel like what's happened in last 15 years is this kind of psychological argument has almost disappeared. Like, what we often see are just the constant repetition of things that have been shown to not be so, which is that stadiums are economic revitalizers. That's the argument you hear all the time, right? Stadiums, franchises, roll out their economists or their fake studies that show that this building is going to revitalize the neighborhood, it's going to create jobs, it's going to do this, it's going to do that. And now as they become centerpieces of real estate developments, that's another way in which the new way that the stadium has been sold to the public. And yet, if you read the book, I'm making a semi-pro stadium argument because I think that they historically have produced value that doesn't translate into a metric. No stadium is going to come out in the black. They're money pits by definition. They cost too much to build and they cost too much to maintain, right? So the question is, well, why do we need them? Right? I think there are models of stadiums that have been successful insofar as that it's provided functions for a wide variety of people for a wide variety of purposes. The building I always go to is the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, which is still operating. It's now controlled by USC. But if you look at that building's history, you see how it was a place for civil rights rallies, it was a place for graduations, it was a great place for the local Mexican-American, evangelical church to have events, right? It really was a genuine community institution. And I do think that many of these buildings, especially they last a little while, more than 2 decades, they can't provide that function. I do think some college stadiums, maybe even perhaps Darrell K. Royal Memorial Stadium, is an example of how a building can be used for football games, but also for academic units, right? I'm not saying that that's the best, although actually the academic units in Darrell K. Royal that's actually prime real estate in the university.
Well, there's a lot happening right now because they're shrinking the student section to make way, right? Because now that Texas is back.
Yes, they are. So now we're going to
they are the student ticket, the big ticket. The student section is shrunk. So there is this very interesting corporatization happening around the stadium, and it's also going to be remodeled and all this.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is because, as you said, Dave, most of these buildings are contingent on or controlled by the public, right? That if we really care about these buildings and if we care about this question, which is an open question, why should anybody care about this now? We are trying to fight off the onset of fascism in this country. But I think that we have to demand that these buildings really provide the usages that they have in the past. And I think what's happened is that as clubs ask for their own specific stadium for their own purposes, then we are completely taking out the actual central role that these buildings can play in a community. Yeah. We're just replicating a kind of corporatized structure that's going to make Steve Ballmer happy or whoever the owner is. And I think that that's the problem.
I was going to say, it is also fascinating how human interaction with the physical structure also has the effect of changing the structure. Yeah. During the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in Washington, D.C., the stadium was the meeting point. Some days, a couple of the Wizards came out. One day, they came out and actually led it. But that started organically by people because it was a central location. Everybody knew where it was. Everybody had kind of like a positive association with it because at the time, it's so funny. Like it was because John Wall and a younger Bradley Beal had so much personality and charisma that I wonder if today, oddly, they would say, why would we meet there? They're the Wizards. I don't know. It's just sports can be very fickle sometimes, but it really did transform that space into a kind of political space. And then when you saw the NBA, we could talk about the contradictions of this, but it was interesting how in 2020, they opened up a lot of the stadiums as voting centers, voter education areas, and how interesting that they did not do the same thing or the same public rollout in 2024. Right. Those are all calculations.
Well, because also half of what they tried to do in 2020 didn't actually happen.
Right.
Like, they were very public about saying they were going to use it like that, but there was huge accessibility issues to actually operationalizing half of the stadiums for voter needs. So,
disaster.
It was a disaster.
And yet, or certainly in 2020, it does play the stadium voting plays a significant role.
Yeah.
It's certainly in Atlanta, Georgia, where 50,000 people were able to vote and vote in a very consequential Senate election, and obviously the presidential one. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what I talk about at the end of the book: the kind of advent of stadium voting, which provides a kind of bare minimum public function that these buildings can provide because they're accessible, because they are managed by management teams that know how to manage crowds. I mean, they are ideal places for civic education. They are. Civic engagement.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Well, I have 3 questions, but my third one would bring us way down the rabbit hole into Formula One, and it's too early for me to go on that because I'll never come back.
And you can speak about Formula One much more definitively than I can.
I'll just talk for the rest of the night about it. Anyways, my 2 questions are, 1, you mentioned the labor and you mentioned the maintenance of these stadiums, and I want to talk specifically about laborers in the stadium. I keep thinking about this moment. One of the Williams sisters was playing, and all of the workers come out into the stands and the steps, I think it was Venus, to watch her win that first championship. And when it's a really grainy clip, but when you see it, you're struck immediately by all this juxtaposition, right? So you're struck by her being the one black girl in this lily white sport, and as you mentioned in the book, the racial demographics of the fans. And we were at the U.S. Open, 2 years ago?
2022.
And we were talking about how different it feels. But in that clip, you can see how white all the fans are. But then as she gets closer and closer to winning the set, the camera starts picking up concession workers standing and clapping for her. And all of a sudden, it's like melanin is like creeping into the steps, but they're there as laborers, right? And so when I would like to just get your thoughts for a second on labor. We talk about athletic labor, and I think you talk about athletic labor a lot, very well in the book. But I'm also thinking about maintenance. Who are the grounds crews? Who's the concession workers? I think that we all often dismiss the economic arguments because they never bring as many jobs as they say they're bringing. But there are people laboring in a non-athletic way in these spaces that are maintaining them. And so I have a question. I would love to hear your thoughts about that. And then my second question, as you talked about this time where clubs are getting their own things and everybody, one of the things that's happening is we're seeing that especially in the expansion of women's sports. I worked on a package for ESPN this year on Kansas City's soccer stadium, the NWSL stadium, that they were very proud of because they were the first dedicated stadium, they said, in the world, I don't believe it, but it went through ESPN fact check, that was dedicated just for women's sports. And I did the package for them, it was cute or whatever, but my question was, what does that mean? What does a stadium built for women's sports look like? What does a feminist stadium look like, right? Is it nursing rooms? Is it accessibility? Is it just replicating all of the contradictions of stadiums that you've laid out and saying, but it's for women? There's something about the way that access to practice facilities and stadiums has become a benchmark for the growth of women's sports, much similar to your chapter on the gay games, right? It's become legitimizing. But I'm wondering, what would it look like to think about stadium spaces that actually reflect differences and not just say this is the same, it's a stadium, but now it's for women and that means something because we're saying it does.
Dave,
And do we judge them differently if, say, there's a predominantly female workforce whose union got busted by the guy who runs the stadium, or do we see it differently if it's actually an empowered workforce? Because I've noticed that too, Frank, and I'm sure you have as well. In a lot of the recent stadium bids also, there is that contesting of, well, if they're union jobs, that will sweeten. And I've noticed that, wow, for the service industry, unionization is oftentimes far more on the table and a public question for these stadium deals, which I find interesting. I had another question if I could throw it.
Throw it in there. Go.
No, yeah.
You feel okay.
I'll try to answer them. These are great questions.
No, I mean, I've marched against, picketed against stadiums, public funding for stadiums, and I think that can be a righteous cause, particularly if your roads are messed up, schools falling down. There's definitely an argument, a just argument, that says this is not where the money needs to go. But I do also notice that sometimes the same people who say things like, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance, who are then the ones making that pure economic argument about dollars and cents, and maybe not thinking about that bigger picture of some of the things, certainly that Amira was talking about what a stadium can mean, what it can do, and also how it can maybe even operate in a progressive way that the so-called owner of that stadium never expected.
Yeah.
And do you think some of that comes from a little bit of a broader elitism that we have in this country about sports?
Oh, sorry. I just have to tag on.
Keep going, and then they'll answer the
question.
question.
Yeah, because I think maybe something that's really hard comes down to sports. So like in Austin, we just have our first professional sports team. We have Austin FC. Mm-hmm. But it came to Austin because Columbus, they tried to stranglehold the city into raising tax funds to build a stadium in a new location, and they effectively said no. And as a result, they lost their soccer team. And those owners came to Austin FC. So our entire club comes out of a resistance to public funding of a new stadium on the heels of a perfectly fine stadium that was already in existence. And yet I know all this intellectually, but I love Q2. And there's something about the energy in that place. And when I was deciding to move to Austin, or not to leave Penn State to work at UT, I happened to be in Austin with our friend Jessica Luther, and we went to the first ever game at Q2, which was a U.S. Women's National Team game there. And it was before Austin FC got to play in there. They christened it. And it was the Austin of my imagination, right? Mm-hmm. Like local food, a wonderful cross-sector of people, the chants, there was something really captivating about it. And as the sun was like setting and you see the water tower, and I was like, I could live here. And I think that was really powerful. And that, right, is almost compelling enough to make me forget why it has arrived.
Yeah. Because I do think that if you're going to see crowds that better reflect the communities where you'll find these stadiums, it's in the soccer stadium today.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. I saw that clearly when NYFC was playing at Yankee Stadium, and if you compare the Yankee crowd to the NYFC crowd looks like a New York that even includes the Bronx, right? Whereas a Yankee Stadium, you don't see much of the Bronx, with the exception of the black and brown concession workers and security workers, right? So I do think, soccer and women's sports in this country are at this kind of interesting tipping point in terms of they're going to go the way of popularity and corporatization. I mean, that seems inevitable, but there are these undeniable particular spectator performance cultures that you see at WNBA games, that you see in probably the Q2, I imagine. I haven't been there yet, right? And that's something somehow that it'd be wonderful if we could hold on to that, right? I mean, I think we've seen that in the past. I mean, people romanticize working class crowds in historic venues that don't exist anymore. I do it all the time in terms of Yankee Stadium, right? So I think there is something about these particular structures, this particular sport, at this particular historic moment in this country that allows for this sort of experience and experimentation like the Kansas City Stadium that you don't see at the NFL or the NBA in the same way. Right. Or the MLB, certainly.
Yeah. Amira's inspired me that I think we should all tell our most goosebumpy stadium story that maybe has an influx of politics in there too, because I think it does give that perspective. I'll tell y'all, one of my most treasured memories at a stadium didn't happen when I was 12 years old. It happened a year and a half ago, where, I know, it's a little sad actually, but I was at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, which, and the crowd, as it normally is at Dodger Stadium, is hugely, I don't want to say overwhelmingly, but hugely people of Latin American descent. I mean, LA is a baseball town, first and foremost, and the Latin American fan base is huge. So that's a lot of the vibe at Dodger Stadium. It was also the 75th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the Major League Baseball color barrier. So not only smashing the color line, so not only were we awarded with the sight of the almost 100-year-old Rachel Robinson, his widow, far more than just his widow if you know her history, but come out onto the field to rapturous applause. But the Dodgers gave out 50,000 really high-quality Jackie Robinson jerseys, and everybody had them on. So you have this crowd. I mean, you hear all about divisions in the United States, this group against that group, and how people are set against each other. To be in a largely Latin American crowd giving a standing ovation to Rachel Robinson wearing a Jackie Robinson jersey, I mean, I don't know where you get that with all of its implications, if not at a sporting event.
Yeah, and I think if there is a value to stadiums, it is, even in this digital age, and people have heard me say this before, it's one of our, the dwindling number of places of in-person interaction, right? That, seems to continue. And certainly the pandemic showed when games were shut down and fans were not allowed into venues that, stadiums matter to people, right? Even if it is just to go and see their favorite team week after week or, year after year, right? So I think that, those moments happen. The moment I always talk about, which I'm going to go in a different direction, some people have heard this story, is that the Oakland Coliseum, which is a venue that has been derided and dismissed and criticized over and over again with good reason from a design standpoint. In 2012, went to an Oakland, a kind of meaningless Oakland A's, California Anaheim Angels baseball game, afternoon game, 3 o'clock game, whatever it was, 10, 12,000 people there, sitting in the lower deck in an affordable seat. And behind me is a bunch of kids who were there on a school trip. I guess it was May, so I guess school was still in session. And then to my immediate right behind me, was a black woman sitting by herself with a book, with a sun hat, eating sunflower seeds, taking in a game. And that brought me chills, because I said, this is what this kind of venue has provided for Oakland and for black folks in Oakland for 50 years, right? That this woman could be there and experiencing a degree of freedom, right? Of actually a lack of surveillance, of being able to take in an event just because, right? On a regular weekday in Oakland, to me, that is one of those things that etched in my memory when I think about what a stadium can provide a community, because it provides, when it's accessible, that sort of experience that everybody can enjoy, right? A leisured experience of and even in terms of self-presentation, everything was, she looked like a regular at the Coliseum, right? And I think that that's what we've seen in many buildings in this country. More often than not, to go to your original question, those black and brown people are either the high-paid or not so high-paid athletes on the pitch or in the court, or they're in the concession, security apparatus that provides safety and, well, not so much safety actually, because I'm not convinced that the security guards are there to provide any safety. They're actually there to segregate crowds. That's why they're there. And I think that's what we see more often than not, in many stadiums across the country, I think. So I do think that, if you're going to look for the kind of way forward, I do think it's in these kind of, these sports that are still in formation or still emerging, and the hope is that people who work in these industries can really fight hard. I know this is an active debate in women's sports. Like, where is women's sports going to go, and how is it going to be different, right? Will it remain different? It have its particular spectating performance cultures that it has had, certainly since the Title IX era.
Yeah. It reminded me, sorry, Dave. It reminded me, though, of the football in Atlanta, where their supporter groups are really distinct. So there's like Footy Mob, which is like black supporter groups. There's like the family-friendly section. There's like if you want to get shit-faced with your friends, like you go. And so they all have these like disparate tailgate cultures, and then they like funnel in together in this really interesting way. And so I do think that there's this really, there's a lot of salience to this point around where we're seeing something in formation. But I also think that a lot of these things are at a precipice of picking up the continuity that you've woven through this.
Yeah.
One more point, and then I want to turn to a couple of questions from the audience, if we could.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say is when you talk about the segregation of labor and it being around more of a racial capitalism in terms of the spectatorship, I just want to point out that there's also an interesting shade of gray there as well, where some teams have black fan bases that show up.
Like Atlanta.
And being one example, but where I come to you from, I'm from New York, but I live in Maryland, right outside of DC, and it's wild, like the Washington Commanders' deep roots in the black community, even though their owner was the biggest racist in the NFL, but deep roots, and now, the stadium for 20 years plus has been in Prince George's County, majority black county, and, half an hour away, you have the Baltimore Ravens, and it's 90% plus white. So it's wild how teams, even in small areas, can become totems of segregation.
But some of that too is just I'm sorry. This is just a way for me to remind everybody that the Celtics are reigning champions. But like the erasure of black Celtics fans has always been a thing, which is why then during the parade, everybody's like, where are all these black people coming from? It's like, that's a very clear space, right? Like most of us, if you grew up at all in New England, only went to Fenway when like Dare took you there, right? When I went to school in Baltimore, I could see Red Sox for cheaper with a Hopkins ID for $7 on Tuesday night, and it would be mostly Red Sox folks because it was cheaper to come down to Camden Yards than to go to Fenway. And the same is true with the Garden. And yet everybody still is very attached to that team. And I think that's one of these kind of interplays that then all of a sudden you're seeing the parade and everybody's like confused because it doesn't match up with what you see during a game at all.
And you're right. I mean, LA itself, as you said earlier, right, has substantial Mexican American Latinx fan base, right? And so, the kind of racial dynamics that I see very clearly in a Yankee stadium, are different in Atlanta or New Orleans or Los Angeles or San Antonio, where I've gone to many games to see the Spurs with my in-laws.
And that is where we ended up going to actually get Zachary tickets.
Because those seats have always been more affordable.
So much more
At least from the perspective of a professor, for sure. So we have a little time for a couple questions. We've already kind of been launching into bigger questions, as a result of our conversation. So I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask a very brief question. If you can identify yourself, that'd be nice too, but you don't have to do that.
Hello, I'm David. I'm from Queens, so Queens represent, get the money. So there's a lot of talk about, the Met Stadium, right? There's a new, I don't know how to pronounce the name of that company, Etihad or something like that, for the New York Football Club. There's also talks about a Hard Rock casino. This is all happening in the sort of like general Flushing area. And my local state senator, Jessica Ramos, was recently in a very sort of big fight over economic development in that general area, and people in Queens, it seems that there's a sort of like general sort of gentrification wave. I mean, Eric Adams recently started the whole Restore Roosevelt Avenue project. It received, mixed reception, especially among people who were interested in seeing more or less, a sort of change in the kind of everyday social life, whether it be crime or vending outdoors. My area is a very sort of organic place where, life sort of just happens, the legal stuff comes after because it's a life necessity, et cetera. And I was very much captivated by this sort of continuing discourse about how stadiums are constantly being substantiated, explicated for their economic incentive, right? That the jobs are bringing in prosperity, et cetera. But, Jessica Ramos had very, very strong criticisms of it. She's saying, you know what, this isn't for us. The community board doesn't like it. We don't need an extra sort of like complex. So I'm wondering, there's a lack of communication between the everyday person there. There's a lot of immigrants there who are disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. A lot of this is happening, right? A lot of the decision making for creating massive complexes is happening outside of the representational form of government. Yeah. I personally think that the sort of discourse of economic utilitarianism comes from this lack of representational sort of interaction, right? Or else our conversations would potentially be more moral, maybe more cultural. So that's my perspective, but I wonder sort of like in your experience, I know, Zirin, you've written a lot about gentrification projects as well. What are the sort of like talking points that you see, and what are the sort of like structural elements that bring that discourse to life?
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get to deal with David's question, let's go over here. We'll take two at a time. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was thinking about
the mics work well.
something we talked about a lot in class is this idea of like corporate naming sponsorships for the stadiums. And when we've been talking about that, and today I've been thinking about places like Staples Center in LA, which it's not called Staples Center anymore, but that's what everyone still refers it to it. Nobody calls it Crypto.com Arena. Like that's not its identity. So how do we reckon with like these corporate sponsorships becoming part of like the team's identities in the case of the Lakers and the Clippers, but also the city's identity in a way?
Yeah. Thoughts?
On the second one, that to me is a big welcome to America type moment, because how long have we called tissues Kleenex? How long have we called a copying machine, get a Xerox? It's like these brands become representative of sometimes the most sacred things in our lives, which is really our city. And if you look, the names of our city are not like, hey, where do you live? Oh, I live in IBM City. The names for our city were not chosen on the basis of branding, and yet that's what's become as powerful as any force in sports. I remember when that actually first started, that first wave of stadium naming, and it was actually kind of like the sky is falling. Like people kind of freaked out because we were used to names that were almost like really warlike and patriotic. The kind of Veterans Stadium and Freedom Field, and before
War
you know
Memorial Stadium in Buffalo.
Memorial Stadium, and
Gillette.
yeah, and now you got Smoothie King Stadium in New Orleans.
They give you like massive smoothie coupons at Pelican.
Oh, really?
Games. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I was like, okay, come up with it. I'm not gonna lie.
See, I was at Muhammad Ali's funeral in that stadium, and there was that oddness of like, we are here from Smoothie King on this solemn day. It can.
Or remember in Miami where they had to change the name after whatchamacallit went under? What's it called?
Houston was Enron Field, and then it became Minute Maid after Enron.
But the Miami Stadium, like it lasted like 3 months.
Yeah, I remember that name.
Crypto. No, it was like NFT, the X one. Yeah. I don't even remember because that's how fleeting it was. Yeah. But everybody paid massive amount of money, and it literally lasted 3 months.
Yeah. It's funny, David, your response to the question, the Xerox example is a good one. I mean, it is true, Caleb. I mean, like, Angelinos know that building at Staples. So it's named after a corporation, but it's also because that it had that name for a long time, right? It didn't change every 5 years like some of these other naming rights agreements. So, I mean, there are ways in which, and that's a critique that I make of the contemporary stadium, but there are ways that even the corporatized name can become identifiable with place. I think that's an excellent point. I do. And I do think, this question that was raised earlier, that Dave raised, is about, David, it's just a question about American politics today, which the election makes clear, right? The ways in which, and I'm not a political pundit, and I really have not joined the chorus of people to try to explain what happened at the recent election, but the kind of disconnect and the disaffection between, folks who are citizens and or those who are disfranchised, and the kind of the current political structure is profound, right? And I think part of the reason why these stadium deals are able to be rammed through these state and local legislatures is precisely because of that disconnect. And that's precisely what corporate interests want, right? And so I think the challenge is, how do you build up a kind of, sort of what the Holder Initiative is trying to do? How do we imagine a kind of new form of democratic practice that's going to be rooted in social movements, going to be rooted in real concerns of communities? And how do we empower people who are being, frozen out of this structure, particularly those who are undocumented? And that's going to be a major question for us very soon.
It is fascinating, just in the new Yankee Stadium, although it's not that new anymore, is that I got an up-close view of this. You've got Yankee Stadium, one of the biggest brands on earth. In New York City, one of the most famous cities on earth. And yet the day-to-day to get that stadium done involved South Bronx community leaders, sitting down with Brian Cashman, the GM, cutting deals over the table, under the table. And you know, there is, when we're talking about quote unquote, gentrification, which sometimes the definition of that word can mean so many different things to describe our cities. But like there is an organic process with the neighborhood as well, which demands its own study.
No question, no question.
Cheers.
Last one.
Okay, so you were talking about the 80s, and you were talking, like, you were just talking about, like, this blending of the neighborhood. So, the Coliseum, right next to the Coliseum was an old Warriors stadium.
Yes.
Warriors, I don't know the year, 3 years ago?
Yes.
Moved to, no, 2 years ago, moved to Chase Center, which is now next to the San Francisco Giants Stadium, literally, 5 miles away. I just, not really a question, but, like, I'm interested to hear you guys speak about, like, how, like, the physical location of the stadium and, like, the fan base in the neighborhood area, like, when San Francisco has one of the largest homelessness issues.
There's a
But
great.
stadium, it takes up space, like, there's economic, obviously, and they share parking lots and whatever, but I'm just interested to hear what you guys think about a movement of a stadium when it's not Oakland to Las Vegas, it's literally Oakland to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question. There's a article in the special issue we did of Sports and Embodiment about the gamification in Silicon Valley and the Warriors, and it's called something that I cannot remember, but see me after, I'll give you it. And it's really good because it's about this exactly, and about what all of the layered meaning, like it goes at the heart of the kind of tension in San Francisco and Oakland, and like what this means, right? This relocation means in a way that's kind of different, right, than the conversations that came when the Braves moved, right? When we see it going out to the suburbs, there's a certain articulation of like inaccessibility and whatever, and you saw that the discourse was a little different when we talk about, the Bay, and I think that we know some of the reasons why, but I'll make sure you get the article because they really do a great job at unpacking it.
And in terms of the longer history of the Warriors franchise, which originated in Philadelphia, and it moved to San Francisco first, right? And so what you're seeing in the history of that franchise is kind of the history of the shifting gravity of the pro basketball industry. So it moves to San Francisco, where it played at the Cow Palace, which is down not too far from where Candlestick Park used to be, the southern edge of town. And then it moved to Oakland, because all the franchises, many franchises, moved to Oakland in the late 1960s, early 1970s, right? And so then it moves back across the Bay. So to some degree, what you're seeing is that this long history of the sports industry in that region. How Oakland was seen as this kind of new territory, right? And then San Francisco now, in this new age of gaming in Silicon Valley, becomes the new territory that the sports industry wants to access, right? And that also is reflected when the Giants moved downtown as well, right? Many, many years ago. So unfortunately, we have to stop. I want to thank Dave and Amira for your amazing insights, your amazing questions. I have to say, in all seriousness, I am utterly inspired by your work, have been for many years, and it's been a real delight to talk with you tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and join us for a reception right outside. Thank you.